Alrighty, so today I've got my Chirrut Red update guide. So I've been working on this deck basically since release. I made a video about the original version. The link to that will be in the description. I recommend you check that out if you're kind of new to this deck archetype. This video is going to be a much deeper dive into specific matchups and sideboarding and just tips and tricks about all the things you can do with this deck. It's I'm going to break down the matchup specifically. What I'm not going to do is talk about every single card in the deck. A lot of them are the same from the main version that I made a video about recently. If you want to get an idea about like what the main core of the deck is and like the main cards and why they're in the deck, go check that out over there. As you can see, we got Force Throw front and center. It's the best card in the deck. This is still the best Force Throw deck in Star Wars Unlimited, in my opinion. I think it is a real player. I think you can take down a tournament with this deck, and we'll see how we can do that. All right, so here's the deck. There'll be a link to this deck list also in the description. You can check it out there if you want to take a closer look. What I will do briefly is talk about the differences and like the main new additions that I've incorporated here specifically for the metagame that's currently present. So what we got is here. So Baze Malbus. This card seems kind of weak and clunky, but he's incredibly important in two very specific matchups. That's against Sabine of any variety basically and Boba Green. The 5 Sentinel body is a premium, and it brick walls Sabine's turn quite well, right? On their 4 resource turn, they don't have anything that can one-shot this without something like a Fleet Lieutenant. If he's able to absorb 5 damage, that's fantastic. And if they can't one-shot him, he basically takes down whatever bumps into him because of the grid. It makes Sabine's biggest turn, that flip turn for her, awkward. He does basically the exact same thing against Boba Green, since they typically will be doing their flip turn on your 4 resource turn. They often get very far ahead of us, and that's why Chirrut sometimes has a very big issue beating Boba Green, is because they do their giant flip turn before we do our giant flip turn. Well, Baze messes with that. For instance, a very powerful play they can do is Bosk before deploying Boba. Baze kind of takes care of that being a power play. He also tanks Boba Fett's leader, right? Boba only hits for 4. Additionally, the only way they can really one-shot him is through a Steadfast Battalion with ECL. If they do that, we're kind of happy. We get to Tarkintown their Steadfast Battalion. We trade Baze and Tarkintown for their Steadfast and ECL. We've slowed down their turn majorly, and we can usually catch back up on our flip turn when we do things like Chirrut and Force Throw and other shenanigans like that. Baze is not some auto-win card. It just solidifies a very specific turn in this metagame, which happens to be turn 3 against 2 of the most popular decks in the game. He's mostly taken the place of K2 in my main deck. Now, K2 is also a very strong card in very different matchups. Against basically all the control decks, K2 is an all-star, and against Han decks because of his discard ability being able to tax their hand even further. If where you're playing you expect more control, more Han, I would put K2 in the main deck over Baze. So there's no issue with that change. It just, right now, the week I played this deck at a showdown last weekend. I lost in the finals with this exact list to a Boba Green deck, but went undefeated up until that point. I expected more Boba and more Sabine. So that's why I went with Baze. All right, the other main new card here is Vigilance. This card, I don't need to talk too much about this. It's kind of everywhere right now in basically all blue decks. It's incredibly powerful against Sabine, but it also is powerful against Boba, right? So this is just like Baze. It's a card that I've brought in because it's good into both of those matchups. And just like K2, sorry, not like K2. in contrast with K2, where he's good in control, Vigilance is really not. So like these Baze and Vigilance are cards you would be replacing against in control heavy metagames or putting in the sideboard. The reason Vigilance is pretty good against Boba is they have these ambush threats. Boba, for instance, will usually be able to eat 2 hits. There just tends to be a lot of units that Vigilance can kill. 7th Fleet Defender is another one. That being able to kill something and then nullifying a Fett's Fire Spray attack, right? That's what the Heal 5 does. Bridges us pretty well into Luke, which is where we will usually try to take over a game from them. Last card I've included on this list is Disabling Fangfighter. It's a pretty solid card that I wasn't really trying to include because I wasn't scared of too many upgrades. Although now with the up and coming mono event control decks that are running Entrenched as removal, especially to lock down leaders, I think you just need to have this card in red decks to blow up Entrenches and keep tempo. I've squeezed one into the main deck. I put one in the sideboard. It's not a fancy card. I just think you need outs to Entrenched right now. All right, just briefly why I include the numbers of the events. Open Fire, it's the most important card against Sabine. You just need 3. Sabine is way too popular for you to be trimming on Open Fires right now. You want to draw this card in every game against them, and I've included 3. It's just also not an embarrassing card in other matchups, right? You cut it against a lot of decks, but it's never a dead card, so it's important. Takedown is actually a card I would want to trim even more on. I don't love it. I don't love using 4 resources to answer something. I want to be the one presenting threats. Although, again, its utility is just a little too important. It's good against Iden. It's good in mirror matches. There's just certain situations where it works. And so far I haven't had the courage to cut it from the deck completely. Vigilance, we talked about. Force Throw, best card in the deck. I would play 12 copies of this card if I could. Forces with me, we're up to 3. I think a couple really important things about this. The action cheating is really important because we end up in racing situations against a lot of decks. Being able to not only push damage, but maintain initiative, very strong. The other thing is, with especially things like Yoda, if we can go turn 2 Yoda, turn 3 forces with me, even if we just go face with the Yoda and leave behind a 4/6, it's a really difficult thing for opponents who are trying to interact with you to answer. Additionally, we can honestly just use Yoda to kill anything usually. As a 4/6, it'll kill anything in Sabine that they would have played the turn before, or heal you, leave behind a 4/6. That's a big power play against them. I think there's situations where that can really steal a game from them. So I mostly realized that I want this card all the time. I don't usually want more than 1, so that's why I often was playing 2 copies of it. But since I want the first copy in most games, we're up to 3. It binds all things. I think some people are low in this card. I still think the fact that it's a 2 cost is important because it allows us to pair it with something like Wing Leader on the Chirrut turn to create a big swing, right? We don't have Force Throw in every game. More options for swingy turns is important. So we've got it binds plus a Wing Leader, it binds plus a Jedi Lightsaber. We've got Forces with me and Force Throw. We've got Jedi Saber and Force Throw. We've got Takedown and Force Throw, right? Force Throw, right? We want Force Throw, but it binds will do an adequate job keeping Chirrut alive. It's also a really good card against Palpatine. We'll talk about that a little later, right? But that heal, if they're really counting on a big steal, can snipe a game from them. All right, some brief omissions. Devotion was in the original list. I think I felt comfortable enough taking the list as is and beating Sabine's. If that doesn't sit right with you, if you still feel like Sabine is an uphill battle with this list, Devotion is certainly a very acceptable include. I'd probably not go as far as including it in the main deck, but trimming some of the stuff from the sideboard and playing some Devotions, totally acceptable play. Regional Governor, in and out. In the end, I just don't love it. The fact that it's not a rebel really weakens our initial plan, right? Our initial plan is to play a rebel unit into Fleet Lieutenant or Wing Leader, right? 6 or 5 of our 8 turn 2 units are Rebel Matters cards between Wing Leader and Fleet Lieutenant. Yoda's the only one that doesn't. Regional Governor isn't really a good turn 1 play. So the problem is we need to cut turn like 2 drops to squeeze it in. We can't really cut parts of our event packages in late game. So it ends up trimming on our early drops, but also is not a card we want early. It just was too awkward for me. I think some people have had success with this, specifically against like super laser blast decks. If you can like get them right before they're gonna play it, you might be able to win like on that turn because they were counting on something that they're no longer able to play. But yeah, you can keep trying it. I think if this deck moves away from Rebel Matters, it might be more worthy of an include. Entrenched, for us it would be doing put on our own units because we play too much into the ground and space to be using this as removal. I've tried it as removal against fire sprays and got barraged for 10 and vowed I would never do it again. I think it's an okay thing to include against Sabine. If you want to just like stick this on one of your turn 1 plays, I mean, you're just going to lock up an arena. They're going to be playing Fang Fighters though, which is post board, which can be a problem. And I think all in all, we still are an aggressive slanted deck. We need to be able to attack bases, and Entrenched is not something I've wanted to include. And System Patrol Craft is a cool card. The deck just has too many 4-drops with the inclusion of bays to nullify very important flip turns by leaders. I had to end up trimming on 4s. This one got the cut. It's a fine card, but the games are won and lost on the ground for the most part, and it's why I've relegated to exile. All right, so now the nitty gritty. We're gonna go matchup by matchup. It's not gonna be every matchup, but it's gonna be a lot. I'm gonna have some like sideboard tips in and out, but we'll also talk about the matchup as a whole. And obviously, if the deck changes, the sideboard's gonna change too. Like I know for a fact that I wouldn't play this exact deck in every tournament I would queue it with, but I think if you kind of take away from this discussion ideas for how to play these matchups and ideas for what you may or may want to cut in these matchups, it'll help you even if your deck ends up being 7 cards different or whatever. All right, Sabine. So we're the control in this matchup, and we're pre-boarded pretty heavily for this. We're only cutting 3 cards, K2 and Wing Leader. They're both dead cards in this matchup. K2 doesn't do anything. It's a blank text, and Wing Leader's just way too slow. We'll bring in our 3rd Vigilance and make an opening. Fang Fighter isn't even great here. It's better than Wing Leader, so that's why that comes in. It's just like a filler. Best things we can be doing. Matching arenas with them on turn 1 if possible. Not always possible. Open fire on turn 2 on their turn 1 play is great. So is Yoda, especially if we can follow it up with the forces with me. Sticking either a Yoda or Kanan in this matchup is usually the difference in the healing. The scariest thing Sabine can do is to Wing Leader Sabine on the flip turn into a Metal Ceremony, putting 8 health on her. When that happens, if we can't force throw a Redemption at her, big problem. Unless we've chip damage into her, which sometimes we can if we've gone like Sabine into Yoda into bays, right? That's why we talked about bays, is it really nullifies a really giant turn from them. Another little tip here. So we never really want to attack base until we've stabilized. We much rather just have initiative so that we can lead our turns and get value out of our units. And that's incredibly important while they still have energy conversion lab up if they're playing the green version. For instance, we go turn 2 Yoda, but don't end up with initiative and they ECL that Yoda. It's not great. It's not the worst because our Tarkin Hound can clean up the K2, and it also means they won't be doing a Wing Leader play. So keep that in mind. Like sometimes you might want to just bait a play like that so that they don't buff their Sabine. The other thing we can do if we have initiative and a Yoda in play, for instance, is if they don't have something with 2 health that Yoda can kill, there's no real pressing issue. We don't want to just use Yoda to attack face or attack a unit to chip damage at it. Yoda's health drops, and then they can finish it off with an Overwhelm from K2. So you can use Chirrut's ability to bump it up to 6 health. It negates that K2 ambush, and then also stalls a little bit. It gives us an option to see what it is they're going to do. If we've got Takedown or Open Fire in our hand, or especially Force Throw, it's very important. It's why turn 2 Yoda is so good, is because if we have Force Throw in our hand, we can basically hold hostage a lot of what they're doing as long as Yoda isn't removed from the table. And that's why Chirrut's buff is actually important, because they don't get a clean way of answering it. They're not going to attack twice into Yoda. It's just no way they're going to do that. And Yoda gets to stick around, get a 2 heal off. The other really good plays, like we talked about, Baze on turn 3, just slam it and claim. You're going to prevent a lot of damage. You're going to go into the next turn in a decent position. Takedown is not usually something we can squeeze in on turn 3, because you can't just keep passing actions until they run out of things to do, and then they might just decide to not deploy their leader. If they do something like a Dodonna, I would just take it down straight away, let them deploy. Takedown is a good follow-up into the next turn. So on our 5 resource turn, especially if they haven't had a medal ceremony, so medal ceremony is tricky, but if they haven't, we can take down the Sabine, just start it off like that. It shuts off a giant steadfast battalion ambush, and it leaves us with 1 resource open, which hopefully is a force throw. Once we bridge past that into vigilance, if we're not like seconds away from death, that's usually when we can take over the game. If we can kill something, heal 5, go into our 7 resource turn, sitting pretty, we can keep holding up removal. If we have Luke, again, that will lock up the game, or a second vigilance. I've won plenty of games reaching redemption because of the vigilance bridging. Once you play with redemption, the game is over. You will heal 8. I don't think I've ever lost a game once redemption came into play. So, and it's not as rare as you might think. I spent a lot of time on this matchup because it's a very important one. I know some people have told me they've struggled a little bit with this matchup. I think it's a pretty even matchup, if I'm being honest. It's just not easy sometimes to know all the lines. The more you play it, especially against quality Sabine opponents, the more you'll realize what the tension points are, where you need to be using removal versus just playing like a Yoda or a Kanan, right? It's not always right to just remove something. Sometimes it's better to get your unit into play because it sets up a really big next turn, right? With like, if we go into 5 resources with Kanan in play, sure, maybe we took a bunch of damage the turn before, but we can lead that turn now with a Forces with Me or a Force Throw, which is incredibly powerful. We don't need to like wait to deploy Chirrut to do that stuff. Chirrut isn't actually that important in this matchup because we don't have time to ever really gear him up with lightsabers or wing leaders. He comes in and his main goal is to like hit a battlefield marine and kill it. Like he ends up being around for a little bit and being like a mini removal against a few of their units, but he's not the focus in this matchup. Kanan, Yoda, Vigilance, those are kind of the main winners here, and then just all our removal. Practice this one a lot. Try to make sure that you have initiative as much as possible. I recommend firing this matchup up with Baze. It helped a lot in solidifying it, and good luck with it. All right, the other really big and popular one, Boba Fett. Green is going to be more popular than yellow, although yellow is a very good deck. It's just more are playing the green version. The sideboard strategy is mostly the same. We want the Vanquishes for the fire sprays, make an opening as a good card against 7th Fleet Defender and Crafty Smuggler. Disabling Fang Fighter is fine. Again, 7th Fleet Defender comes in with a shield. These decks sometimes play Traitorous, so it comes in. K2, the 4 health is just the liability against Boba and Bosk, and I'd much rather just be playing Bazes and Kanans on against them. And Open Fire doesn't kill anything important in their deck, right? Like their 3 drops are 7th Fleet Defender and Boba unit. It's an okay card. It's not going to be a dead card. It'll usually be something that finishes off units. The one consideration that is worthy with it is that it plus Tarkin Town can kill a Fett's Fire Spray. Problem is we usually need to use Tarkin Town way earlier to either finish off a Bosk or a Steadfast Battalion. So I haven't found that Open Fire is particularly good here. So what do we do? The first couple turns you want to be aggressive. Things like A-Wing or Sabine into Fleet Lieutenant or Wing Leader are kind of how we want to start this matchup. Force them to answer our units in the beginning. If you can go space, right, like A-Wing into Wing Leader, and their ramp is not resupply, it's a super laser tech, you can make their flip turn a little awkward sometimes. But mostly, we're going to let them flip. We're going to let them ramp. Baze is nice to just kind of block the flip turn, which we talked about specifically during the intro. If they ever like end up weakening some of their units into Baze, right? Like if Boba has to attack Baze, he's now in takedown range. We just want to survive in a decent health pool into our flip turn so that we can Chirrut, lightsaber, or Chirrut, force throw something. No good to me dead is tough, but you can usually beat 1. It's really hard to beat 2. If they play it twice and lock Chirrut down forever, it's really hard to beat them. Force throw is the most important card in this matchup, more so than most, because its ability to one-shot Boba Leader or Fire Spray. I usually prefer to save it for the Fire Spray if I think I can fight them on the ground, which usually you can, especially if you can get Chirrut geared up. You don't have that many good answers, especially game 1, to a Fire Spray. So them going 6 resources Fire Spray and you killing it for 1 by pitching like a Luke or an Obi-Wan or something big can really swing the game. Whereas Boba Leader doesn't scare me nearly as much most of the time because, again, we fight really well on the ground. So unless you're kind of out there at the same time, especially if they don't ramp, and then they just like deploy into your Chirrut and you can fire off a force throw and one-shot their Boba, I often will try to save it. Other than that, we're trying again to bridge into Luke. Our end game of Luke is really strong against their deck. They have a hard time racing it sometimes because of the restore. It can also kill Fire Spray if you've been able to trade some units. And it kills 7 Fleet Defenders, which are really annoying. Other key card is Redemption because it, again, breaks Fire Spray. I say the word Fire Spray a lot because it is the most important card in this matchup. Even more important than Darth Vader, who we can mostly deal with. I mean, it's a very strong card, but it's the Fire Spray that really knocks us out. This is another tough matchup that I feel has gotten relatively close in my testing. I've played against it a bunch, right? So I've gotten a ton of reps against it. I've gotten pretty comfortable and figured out like what it is exactly that they're trying to do, right? The more we can mess with their flip turn, the better. That's why things like Baze are important. If they're not able to do like a full 8 resource flip turn that completely demolishes us, we can do okay. And I think, one more shout out to Forces with me on this one. Because of the shield, it also makes their barrages a little more awkward, because that's often how they want to clean up our board. So being able to kind of pump up and put a shield on something, even if we're just going face, which often will be correct in this matchup, it's important. All right. Darth Vader Blue. It's a pretty new deck. It's basically full control, very few units in this deck. We sideboard a ton in this matchup. This is where all this discard is really strong, right? K2 and Force Surrender puts us at 3 K2s, 3 Force Surrenders, and 3 Force Throws. That's kind of our plan here, is to be aggressive and then demolish their hand. I've kind of, in my testing, if you get to about 4 total discards, you can put them into a top deck. So between if you play 1 Force Throw in the game, 1 K2, and 1 Force Surrender, you can usually force them to be in a top deck mode. At which point, if they're not drawing like Super Laser Blast or like drawing really well, we should be able to win. We are aggro. We're going face all the time. I've only cut 1 open fire post board because I like to have the access to open fire plus Tarkin Town to finish off Lieutenant Charlton. In other matchups where Charlton comes in, I would keep a couple open fires because of that. Takedown doesn't always kill him, because if they can get him to 6 health, that can be a big problem. Obi-Wan's just kind of too slow here. And then Vigilance Bays, right? Vigilance Bays come out in most of these control matchups because they are not for those matchups. That's what we bring in, all this discard and the vanquishes for their Avengers. We play aggro and we go face a lot and we try to rip their hands to shred. Rip their hands to shreds. Yeah. So the last thing, the Fang Fighters, they're basically here because of this deck's popularity and decks similar to it that are playing Entrenched in the main deck as a removal, right? A 2-cost removal for your leader or something else. If they do that and you can Fang Fighter, huge tempo swing. This matchup is not too bad. I think You can maneuver it. Obviously, they're a villain blue deck, so Power of the Dark Side and Takedown are two cards you need to constantly be aware of. It's why Wing Leader and Fleet Lieutenant are extremely powerful in this matchup, because they not only push damage, but they give you units to kind of sack to Power of the Dark Side. And then we just need to find a way to squeeze an upgrade onto Chirrut, which is usually possible because we're the ones presenting threats. And yeah, just go for the hand. K2 almost always go for the hand with it. The only time I wouldn't is if you're far ahead and they use something like I am your father and you're going to let them draw 3 just so you can stay ahead. At that point, the hand ripping is not going to work anymore. But often we just want to take the 7 with I am your father and then just keep ripping their hand up. All right, Han Solo. This is another matchup where we bring in the K2s. I don't bring in the Force Surrenders here because they're playing too aggressive for that to usually be appropriate. But again, this is another matchup where hand ripping is really important between K2 and Force Throw. We can kind of dunk their hand out. They have an issue deploying Han a lot of the time because Chirrut geared up just kind of holds him hostage. Force Throw can hold him hostage. He can come out, but they can only have a couple cards in their hand, and like even if they get something big off, usually we can rip the rest of their hand out and they'll put them into a top deck mode. The biggest issue sometimes are when they play cards like Mon Mothma and Rogue Skirmisher, the ambush vehicle, because those bring back fodder for them. If they start doing that, change the plan, right? K2 is now damage. We don't need them discarding Battlefield Marines. But the goal is to, if they're not refilling their hand, is to kind of rip their hand up, not let them have a big Han turn. That's usually pretty easy to prevent with just holding Force Throw or holding Chirrut back until they just have nothing left to do. They either deploy into the Chirrut or take a bunch of damage and give us initiative. And we're kind of okay with how this works. I think Chirrut is fairly favored into most Han varieties, and I felt pretty good about this matchup. All right, Iden, Krennic, Green. So these are like the soft control decks. These can sometimes be tricky, again, because of Power of the Dark Side and Takedown. You just need to make sure you're not like YOLOing Chirrut out there. Basically, it's the same sideboard strategy as we did with Vader, except we're keeping takedowns instead of open fires because these decks don't typically run Childson, and takedown is really good against Iden specifically, but also against Krennic because he almost always will attack into something. We don't need the Vigilance and Bays here. The rest is mostly a similar strategy as we talked about with Vader. We are the aggro, and we're going for their hand. This Barrage is a tricky card sometimes for us, but they have a lot of issues kind of keeping Chirrut from getting buffed most of the time, and Chirrut pushing damage forces them on the back foot and forces them into like weird situations where they might just have to like bash a Vader into it and hope. If these decks play more Super Laser Blast, I think that actually would start being more difficult for us because they can usually get to 8 resources before dying, and that's why the discard package is so important here. But yeah, the strategy against most of these control decks is very similar. It's just kind of how are they playing more units. If they're playing more units, that usually is okay with us. We don't really want to be trading into them. We just force them to trade into us. And then one note about these matchups, if you start seeing them more, just put K2s in the main deck. They're incredibly powerful into all the control decks, either for the damage or for the discard. All right, Palpatine. The only reason I included this here separately is, well, it's 2 reasons. One is Obi-Wan. You cut him because Palpatine will steal him. It's just like basically guaranteed, and then you'll cry. The other thing is it binds all things in this matchup. I try to sandbag that card for when they're preparing a really big flip turn. If they do something like Super Laser Tech and toss it at something big you have with the expectation that they're about to steal it, and you can heal it off and leave yourself with no damage units in play, you might win on the spot. So just keep that it binds thing in the back of your mind. All right, Green Vader. So Green Vader is not a control deck. I think it's basically just a big mid-range deck. It's why I think it succeeds so well into like stuff like Boba Fett. It's just the bigger version. we're not bringing in forced surrenders here. It's way too slow. Darth Vader will kill you, right? He will usually come out on the turn you're playing forced surrender, if not a turn earlier, if they double ramp. You don't have time for that stuff. Vader decks, Vader green decks are trying to kill you. They'll get chip damage on you throughout the game too with his ping, and sometimes like with their 3-1s or 2-1s that are just floating around. We need to be aggressive. K2s are coming in for the damage here, not for discard, and we don't really want removal as much here. Chirrut with a saber does present a very big barrier for Vader to deploy because it does one-shot him, so it's something you want to keep in mind. The other thing that one-shots him is Force Throw and Redemption, so I'll often just sandbag Redemption in my hand. I try not to resource that card because of that, because if we can knock Vader off the table instantly, we'll be in great shape. Other than that, I would treat this like that you are the more aggro deck. You want to be the one going face more, but you sometimes do need to be trading units or killing units, because they're going to push damage back at you, and they have overwhelming barrage. So if you can keep the board from getting too favorable for them, so then overwhelming barrage isn't as devastating, then that's important. All right, Luke. Luke's a tough matchup. We aren't usually fast enough to get to the point where they're so far on the back foot that they can't do things like Obi-Wan into Luke and to shield Obi-Wan, right? Those are some really difficult things for us to deal with. We want the vanquishes because of that, specifically because Obi-Wan is kind of a problem for us. We need to really rely on Chirrut just being able to one-shot most of the things they're doing. So Obi-Wan or the Luke leader, even things like Echo-based Defender can be annoying. We can't let that thing get a shield. It just eats up too many attacks for us. So this is a difficult matchup. There's not much we can bring in here, especially not from the list I presented. I do just want to call it out. I think maybe this deck is getting a little more popular. I still don't see it very much, but it's just something to keep in the back of your mind. It may be something that we'll want to tweak a little if Luke gets really popular, because the Sentinels he presents between Bright Hope and Echo-based Defender and Obi-Wan are just really annoying, and we have a hard time. It's doing a similar thing that the Han decks are doing, right? They're trying to go big mid-range and then play things like Home 1. Or U-Wing reinforcement. The thing is, Luke, instead, Han tries to do it quicker, which at the expense of his own cards, which we're kind of happy with. Luke isn't trying to do it quicker. He's just playing a bunch of Sentinels until he gets there, and that's a bigger deal for us because they'll often be able to get there, and we aren't pushing damage fast enough. We're not Sabine, right? We're not crushing them so quickly. All right, so this was the update to Chirrut. It'll likely be the last update I do a video on during this set, right? We're less than, actually maybe exactly 2 months away from the next release. I'll be focusing on videos for other decks and other content at this point. I've spent a lot of time with Chirrut. There's no way this will be the only form this deck takes for me. I'll still be playing this deck, still be grinding with it. It might have some tweaks for it, but I think I've presented so much information about it, and I feel confident that if you want to change it up, if you have ideas for other cards in the main deck and the sideboard, that you now have the tools to kind of mess with this at your will. I really like this deck. I'm excited for the future of it too, because I think as far as force synergy goes, Chirrut will likely still be the cream of the crop because of how cheap he is to deploy and how invincible he is when he's out there. So keep your eye out for new force trait cards or force units that'll really elevate this deck. All right, if you got any questions, comments, leave them below. And again, I recommend you check out the previous video. It was Chirrut Red won with the Force. Now we're winning with the Force. Both really, I think it'd be a good watch to get kind of the initial introduction to the deck. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you liked the video. Subscribe to the channel. And until next time, take care.